Tradition and Modernization in Astrology, lecture by Ciro Discepolo at the Italian Institute for Philosophical Studies. From the book Revisione dell'Astrologia, Armenia Publisher, the Italian Institute for Philosophical Studies, located in Naples at the Palazzo Serra di Cassano, is probably one of the most prestigious cultural institutions in the world. Founded, chaired, and directed by professor and lawyer Gerardo Marotta, the Italian Institute for Philosophical Studies has astonished the entire world with its intense and high-quality activity. Suffices it to say that, over the last 20 years at least, almost all living Nobel Prize winners have held conferences and seminars there. I have had the immense honor of speaking there on several occasions, and I believe this is a source of pride for astrology as a whole, which is usually not accepted in universities and other prestigious institutions where culture is taught at the highest levels. The following is the transcript of my last lecture at the Italian Institute for Philosophical Studies. In the winter of 2012, it focused on a theme that forms the essential basis of this book, a theme that inspired me to propose to the publisher Giovanni Armenia the text you are reading, entitled Revision of Astrology, Tradition and Modernization in Astrology. This is probably the fifth or sixth time I've had the honor and pleasure of speaking at this institute, whose walls exude history, civilization, culture, and above all, freedom and tolerance. Here everyone is allowed to speak with an independence of thought that does honor to this institute and is quite rare to find elsewhere in the world. Here I would like to develop some topics related to tradition and modernization in astrology. I will therefore discuss astrology and try to stay within the scope of this extremely interesting topic, without delving into references other than those strictly necessary for the discussion I wish to convey. To discuss tradition and the evolution of astrology, we must first trace the origins of this discipline, briefly reviewing its history and identify the cultural context within which we can place astrology and trace its heuristic path in relation to other parallel and non-parallel disciplines over the centuries. The geographical area where astrology was born corresponds to the area fairly close to the present-day town of Van in Turkey, almost perpendicular to Baghdad and Tbilisi in Georgia, where traces of Noah's Ark are still being searched for today. The first written evidence of astrology's existence dates back to the 4th dynasty of Egypt, around 2800 BC, in the Mesopotamian region under King Sargon of Akkadu. The first stone tablets with astrological inscriptions were found there. Established and universally accepted scholars in both the West and the East, and I refer to Franz Boll, Wilhelm Gundel, and Karl Bezold, considered three of the greatest scholars of astrological history, place the beginning of the written astrological tradition in these places and in these years. If we wish to define astrology, we must first say that it is knowledge. I wish to use this term and speak of knowledge, or a discipline, without delving into the epistemological debate on the scientific nature of astrology, or on whether astrology might be closer to an art than a science, because that would lead us astray. We must therefore ask ourselves how this knowledge arose according to the aforementioned historians, because there are naturally differing theories on the birth of astrology. For example, a dear friend of mine, Elio Cadello, a RAI journalist, wrote a book in which he argues a completely different theory from that of Boll, Gundel, and Bezold, claiming that astrology originated in northern Europe among the Vikings, to meet the needs of navigation using the visual aid of the stars. Although he advances a series of arguments to support his thesis, the mass of available documentation clearly contradicts this hypothesis. There are also other theories, some of them fanciful or even science fiction, regarding the origins of the subject we care about. Jung himself argued that it was unthinkable that such a complex discipline as astrology could have formed and developed in a historical period in which the knowledge of that civilization was not up to the complexity of such knowledge. According to a hypothesis floated by Jung and taken up by other scholars, it almost seems as if astrology was bequeathed to us by a civilization preceding our own, or even brought to us from space by superior intelligences because, as Jung said, it is too complex for the human mind of that era to have developed it in its almost current form. Don't think that the astrology of 2800 BC is so different from today's. There are differences, but it's not as if everything has been completely overturned. The most accredited historians of astrology are mostly German, from Gundel, Bezold to Pukert, all Germans, recently joined by the Dutchman Koku von Stuckrad. Astrology seems to have arisen essentially from practical needs. Why astrology? Whether you want to call it knowledge, a humanistic discipline, an art, or a science, my personal position is that astrology is not a science and certainly not an exact science, as I've sometimes heard from people who have never read a single book on epistemology and are therefore speaking nonsense. Naturally, we're not offering a merit classification here, so if astrology were defined as a science, it would have a blue stamp, while if, on the contrary, it were a human science like literature, sociology, psychology, or psychoanalysis, it would be unreliable. It's extremely important to be careful when defining things, so as not to say stupid things. Astrology is therefore not an exact science, but rather, in my opinion, much closer to an art than a science, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work very well. These are clearly the theses of the historians I cited. But what was the primary purpose for which astrology was born? The then king, the aforementioned Sargon of Akkadu of the 4th Egyptian dynasty, asked his priests, who at the time were astrologers as well as astronomers, doctors, and scientists, how he could obtain the best warriors for his army. The astrologers instructed the ruler to promulgate laws forcing his subjects to conceive during the month of July. This was because the best warriors are born under the sign of Aries, as had already been noted in 2800 BC. Astrology is in fact a science whose instrument of knowledge is simply observation and the collection of information derived from observations. Through centuries of observation, even a blind man would have seen that Aries were indeed the best warriors. They are so today, and they were also so 2800 years ago. This is the practical purpose for which astrology was born in a largely rural and peasant civilization, to investigate practical matters such as choosing the most propitious lunar phase for decanting wine, or the best time for planting and harvesting. This then leads to a series of aphorisms used for generations and still used today. Try convincing a farmer to decant wine during an unfavorable lunar phase. You might say the farmer is superstitious in an age when man has already been to the moon, but the farmer certainly doesn't want to lose his wine. In parallel with astrology, civilizations after the Egyptians developed a series of knowledge. Here I owe my mother-in-law, a brilliant sociologist at the Federico II University of Naples, who has published several very interesting books, a crucial bibliographical recommendation for me at a time when I was developing a theme for a book on medical astrology. The advice consisted of studying the book by the philosopher of science Alexandre Koyré, From the World of Approximately to the Universe of Precision, one of the key books in the development of my research in recent years, along with the book by another sociologist, Henri Laborie, In Praise of Escape, also recommended to me by a sociologist friend. In his study, Koyré asks why, despite the fact that certain knowledge acquired in Hellenic civilization could be immediately transformed into tools, machines, with which man could industrialize his era, it took 20 centuries to reach the mechanization of the 17th century. In his analysis, the sociologist specifically addresses the case of Galileo Galilei and his telescope. The telescope already existed 4 centuries earlier because, according to legend, the young son of a Dutch spectacle maker, placing 2 lenses side by side, noticed the magnifying effect. For 4 centuries, civilization had progressed by keeping 2 pairs of spectacles side by side, and no one had ever thought of placing one pair behind the other, realizing that they could thus form a telescope. When someone finally thought of it, Galileo made some small modifications with a specific purpose: to bring Saturn's rings into focus, moving from the field of the spectacle maker to that of the craftsman who perfected Galileo's instrument and turned it into a telescope, thus allowing humanity to make giant leaps forward. Koyré focuses on the touchstone of this discussion. I'm talking about alchemy. Although the Middle Ages had instruments that allowed the precursors of today's chemists to use measurement thermometers to measure temperature and scales to weigh quantities, these were not used in alchemy because the indications of measurement were rather approximate. There was no need for almost obsessive measurement, as is the case today. Nowadays, everything relies on measurement, which is why cases like that of the 2 lawyers convicted for the murder of student Marta Russo at the University of Rome can arise. During the trial, a witness reported precisely from which window of which building, from what height, and at what angle the bullet had been fired, while a second expert said that the bullet had been fired from the opposite side, from a much higher floor, at a much deeper angle. In some ways, then, perhaps our ancestors had understood something fundamental, that the most important tool for advancing human civilization and culture is our brain, which produces far more truth analogically than strictly logically, that is, in the narrow corridors of numeration or mathematics. Sometimes I hear people talking nonsense, claiming that mathematics is an exact science, unaware that mathematics is actually a form of logic. Let's go back to the 17th century. You will surely agree that this was an extraordinary century of renewal, evolution, and change in the history of humanity. Let's start with astronomy, astrology. In ancient times, these were the same thing, and even the last 5 great astronomers of the modern era, Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, Kepler, Galileo Galilei, and Isaac Newton, were also great astrologers. Aside from Brahe, who died in the early 17th century, the others wrote their most important works in the mid-17th century. That was therefore a crucial century because free spirits like Kepler, who, I confess, is my hero on the astrological, astronomical, mathematical, and physical levels, endured a life of hardship rather than renounce their ideas, or like Galileo, who was forced to recant. This intellectual independence, however, did not belong to Brahe, who, in order to obtain a chair of astronomy in Bohemia, renounced Copernicus and his ideas. Newton, on the other hand, was more fortunate. He was president of the Academy of Sciences in London for years, where a decidedly different atmosphere prevailed. Until the 18th century, astrology was a container where related disciplines coexisted, yet they took on the characteristics of the places where they were developed, and the masters who developed and taught them. In the Middle Ages, for example, Ficino's astrology was quite different from Albumazar's astrology in Persia, where great mathematicians developed a highly refined astrology based almost exclusively on spherical trigonometry. The 17th century saw a significant break with the thought of a certain Morin de Villefranche, which constituted the watershed between the medieval tradition and modern astrology. Notes: I corresponded with Cocu von Stuckrad, who teaches history of religions not far from Amsterdam, and is the author of a beautiful and voluminous history of astrology published by Mondadori, specifically regarding this book. After I pointed out to him some inaccuracies in his volume, von Stuckrad responded very kindly, admitting the errors and promising to correct them in a future edition, citing the sources.